Welcome to the Cafe Culture Podcast, a series of discussions on politics, philosophy, culture and science.
So we're delighted to have Dr. Kayleigh Garthwaite with us this evening. Dr. Garthwaite's currently at the School of Social Policy at Birmingham University. Previously, she's worked in the North East at Newcastle and Durham Universities, and she's originally from Stockton-on-Tees. She'll be speaking about her work on Foodbanks, a project that she's conducted over the last 4 years, supported by the Leverhulme Foundation. And her work on this just discussed in the book has just won the British Academy's Peter Townsend Prize. So we're delighted to hear more about the project this evening.
Okay, thank you. And thank you everybody for coming along tonight. It's great to see a full house. So what I'm going to do tonight is just try and talk quite briefly about the project that I've been working on. So first of all, talking about how and why I did the research. Before I talk a bit more about food banks, because I don't know how much knowledge that you might or might not have about food banks. So I'll just talk a little bit about how the Trussel Trust food banks work, explain who uses them and why, before talking a bit more about my findings of my time spent in the food bank. Before moving on to talk about some political responses to food banks and how that can result in stigma for the people using them, and before finally giving some sort of concluding thoughts about the future of food banks in the UK. But what I want to do first of all, just to start off, is just to read the very introductory passage to the book. So I think it gives us really quite a good context for what I'm going to be saying tonight. So this is an extract from my field notes from Friday the 6th of March 2015. So it had been a fairly quiet morning so far in the food bank when a young woman came in, nervously wrapping her battered winter coat around her pregnant bump. I took her red voucher and motioned for her to sit down with me while Maureen, one of the volunteers, made her a cup of tea. Gemma, 32, told me that she lived around the corner from the food bank in a private rented tourist house, and this was her first visit to the food bank. Her and her partner had had no money for the last 3 weeks while they waited for the joint job seekers allowance claim to be processed. 0. I asked about her bump. It was really small, so I expected her to say she was around 6 months pregnant. Gemma said she was actually due to give birth to her first child on Tuesday, a son who they were naming Louis. Tuesday. Have you told the DWP that you're just days away from giving birth? I asked her. She said, I was crying on the phone to them yesterday, telling them that I'm pregnant, but they still said it could be another week. She said, I don't want my baby coming home to a house with no gas or electric. We have laminate floor and it's just really cold. So 4 days before giving birth, Gemma was at the food bank, asking for an emergency food parcel, when what she should have been doing was what other pregnant women might be doing 4 days before giving birth, maybe packing a hospital bag or putting the finishing touches to the baby's nursery. Instead, she was making tearful, frustrated phone calls to the DWP, sitting in a freezing cold house and worrying about how to feed herself, her partner and her newborn baby. So welcome to Food Bank Britain. And the reason I'll start with that is because although it is a shocking story, it wasn't unusual. Throughout the course of my research, I met quite a few people in similar situations to Gemma. I think what it does is it just provides us with an introduction so that I can actually start telling you a bit more about how I did the research. But as you can hear there from my field notes, how I began doing the research, I became a volunteer in a Trussel Trust food bank in Stockton-on-Tees 4 years ago now, in November 2013. And how I got involved with the food bank was the project that I was working on at the time, which was looking at local health inequalities in Stockton-on-Tees, a project looking at really trying to explain the health inequalities in Stockton, which at the time of doing the research were the largest in England. So for men living in Stockton-on-Tees, the average life expectancy for a man living in the most deprived part of Stockton compared to a man living in the most affluent part of Stockton, there was a gap there of 17.3 years. So in just 2 miles, the life expectancy was such a massive gap. And for women, again, it was the largest in England at 11.4 years. So what the project that I was working on, which was funded by Leverhulme Trust and led by Professor Claire Bamborough, who's in Institute of Health and Society here at Newcastle, the project was really trying to look at what was going on in Stockton-on-Tees. And so my part of the project was to do ethnographic research, which means going and spending lengthy periods of time within particular communities to try and really grasp what's going on and get a feel for how some things work and social issues. So what I did was started off trained up to be a Trussel Trust volunteer, and I went to the Trussel Trust Foodbank in Stockton-on-Tees on a weekly basis, and pretty much I did everything that all the other volunteers would do. So I packed up the food parcels that people would come and receive. I dealt with the administration of the red voucher, which I'll talk about in a moment when I explain a bit more about how food banks work. And I went to the Tesco's collections twice a year that they have. You might have seen them in the local supermarkets, where food bank volunteers like myself will go along and ask people to just pick up like an extra tin of something on the shop. So I basically got involved as much as possible with the day-to-day running of the food bank. And it was important as well, obviously, that everybody who came to the food bank and all the volunteers, they knew exactly why I was there and what I was doing. And everyone was really keen to talk to me and be part of the research, because they very much wanted the stories to be heard. And that's what I've tried to do with Hunger Pains, is really focus on the people's stories, the people who I met in the food bank, but also the volunteers and people involved in the food bank system. So that leads me on to talk and explain a little bit about how food banks work. Like I said, I don't actually know how much you might or might not know about them, but since 2010, there's been a massive food bank explosion in the UK. Leading to, in 2015 to 16, there was the first time ever that 1 million people used a food bank. And now last year there were 1.2 million food parcels given out, and 435,000 of those went to children. So it's been a massive increase since 2010, when there was just over 100,000 food parcels given out. And that rise you can link it to a lot of the problems that we've seen with welfare reform and austerity. So almost half of the reasons why people are using food banks in the first place are linked to benefit delays, benefit sanctions, where people's benefit can be stopped from a period of 4 weeks up to the most extreme examples of 3 years. And some of the most common reasons for people getting benefit sanctions are things such as missed appointments, not applying for enough jobs, and those sorts of things. So those two together, benefit delays and benefit sanctions, make up around 50% of the reasons why people are needing to use food banks in the first place. And so what then happens is, what people have to do is receive a red voucher from somewhere like Citizens Advice or the GP before they actually can receive food from the food bank. And I think that's something over the course of the research, and also in doing talks like this, I find that there's actually a lot of misconceptions or just lack of knowledge about how food banks can actually work, especially among people who are using them themselves. They don't sometimes know how they can actually access the support. But actually, to get a food bank voucher, it can require jumping through quite a lot of hoops in the first place. So it's not just that people can turn up and receive a free bag of food. It's actually quite a complex process of, you need to be working with an agency that you already know, such as, like I said, Citizens Advice or Drug and Alcohol Services, mental health, for you to get that voucher in the first place. So it's not a case at all that people just turn up and pick what they like off the shelves. And then people, once they have got this red voucher, they can come to the food bank and receive 3 days' worth of food 3 times in a period of crisis. So it's very much a time-limited offer that people are given. And the food in the parcel, it's sort of basic things such as baked beans. We get so many baked beans. There's an entire cupboard at the food bank with baked beans. So if you are going to donate to a food bank, please don't give baked beans, because there's so many of them. But other things such as basic items like coffee, sugar, which actually sugar was taken off the list by Trussel Trust recently because they felt it was an unhealthy item, which I think there's a lot as well I could say about that later on. But yeah, so basic things, pasta, rice, tea, coffee, those sorts of things. People get a couple of bags of food. Generally, for one single person, it's around £15 in value. And so, like I say, they can receive that support 3 times in a crisis period. So it's very much determined to be meant to be just very much a stopgap. So it's not meant to be something that people are relying on over the long term, even though in practice sometimes people are needing to use food banks more than 3 times, because, like I say, if we take the example of Gemma, who was waiting, she had 0 income, then 3 food parcels wasn't actually going to help her in that situation. So she actually might need support over the longer term. So I think that raises questions as well about the sustainability of the food bank model and who it's actually helping, and what sort of crises that it's actually attending to. And I think as well that these issues are even more prevalent at the moment with the rollout and full implementation of universal credit, which is seeing people waiting 6 weeks before they receive any money at all. So food banks have reported a 16% increase in areas where universal credit rollout is fully being realised. But I was reading this morning on a newspaper article that some food banks have reported an 85% increase in the areas where universal credit is just being rolled out. So I think as we go forward, we're going to see even bigger increase in food bank use in the future. So I think that covers enough about how they work. If there's any sort of more specific questions about that a bit later, that's fine. But I want to move on now really to talk about some of my findings. And like I said earlier, I really wanted to focus on the sort of narratives and stories of people using the food bank, because I didn't want to write just sort of, academic papers that other academics might or might not read. I wanted to produce something in the book that was sort of written for a more general lay audience, something that could really sort of explain how a food bank works, why people are using them, and also what it feels like for people who are going to them. So I think as well, it's really interesting to look at the sort of narrative, the political narrative around food bank use in the past sort of 5 years. Originally, when food banks first sort of became a bit more popular, David Cameron back in 2010 described food banks as part of what he called the big society. So he talked about them as being, the volunteers doing good work, providing a sort of social good. But then as they've sort of risen a lot more, food bank use has risen, and they've been linked a lot more by academics, charities, frontline workers, been linked a lot more to welfare reform and austerity. That sort of narratives fell away, and now we very much see one that actually focuses on individual failings of people using food banks. So newspaper articles from Conservative politicians will talk about people who are unable to best manage their finances, people who can't budget, who spend the money on things such as tattoos and well-kept dogs, according to Edwina Curry in one quote. And I think we see as well, just 2 weeks ago, this sort of narrative it just hasn't given up at all, because we had Jacob Rees-Mogg talking about food banks, and he actually described them as uplifting. And he said one of the reasons why food bank use has risen is because Conservative government have allowed job centres to give out red vouchers, which is actually not true, because if you look at last year, the amount of food bank vouchers given through DWP and Job Centre was actually less than 5%. So it doesn't at all account for the rise that we've seen in food banks. So I think what that represents again is it's just really not sort of recognising or being aware of or being able to admit that it's structural problems. It's low paid work, precarious work. It is the problems with the benefit system, and I think with problems with universal credit, like I say, we're going to see this a lot more going forward. So very much the sort of political narrative from politicians in the media is focused on the reason why people are using food banks as being sort of an individual failing in themselves, which then leads to issues around discussions around, are people genuine? Do they deserve to be used in a food bank, which we've seen a lot of. And I think then the problem is, and what I've found during the research, is that sort of idea of, are people genuine? Should they be using food banks? It very much gets inside people's heads who are coming to the food bank. So they would talk a lot about how they would experience, stigma and shame and just embarrassment as well at actually having to come to a food bank. And a lot of people who I met during I've actually been involved with the food bank for 4 years now. Even though the book is based on 2 years of my research, I still volunteer. I was there last week, so they can't get rid of me. I've been involved now for 4 years, pretty much the entire time that one particular food bank's been open. And I think throughout that time, it's clear that people will really draw on all of their other available resources. So, family and friends, they'll use whatever savings they might have. They'll try selling items in the home before they'll even come to the food bank, because for most people it isn't an experience that they would describe as uplifting in any way. So what I want to do now, though, is just again read you an example of somebody from the book called Paul. And I think Paul's story in the book is really a good example of why it's important not to just talk about people in terms of being deserving or undeserving. And so Paul was in his late 30s, but he looked much older than his years. He'd been to the food bank around 9 times that I knew of. His clothes were filthy and they hung off his skinny frame. I sat with him as he put 3 spoonfuls of sugar in his tea. His eyes were always distant, and there was a bit of a lag between me asking him questions and him responding. The first thing he told me was that he said he was all right, but he was sad as he didn't see his 11-year-old daughter often enough. She was in foster care, and he'd been in care himself when he was younger, and he didn't want the same thing for her, he said, but he and his ex-partner, were both long-term drug addicts with alcohol problems, so social services had placed her in foster care. Paul was on a 3-month sanction for failing to turn up to an appointment at a private sector welfare to work company a few miles away in Middlesbrough. I asked why he'd been sanctioned, and he said, "I couldn't be asked to get out of bed." I was a bit taken aback as no one had ever actually said that to me before, and Paul said he'd since been given free bus tickets so that he would attend his appointments from now on. And he said he wanted to be a chef when he got sorted, but at the minute there weren't any jobs going. He was now getting a hardship allowance of £69 a fortnight. Paul, the main thing he said was that he was bored. All he did every day was play on his Xbox 360 day in, day out. But the only problem is, he said, he would keep taking it to cash converters, and he would sell it to them for £69, and then he would buy it back for £50, and he would regularly do that. He says it's all right at the time when you get the money, but when you have to go and buy it back, so he's regularly losing money on buying it. What Paul was telling me that he had a rescue dog, Benny, who he used to buy dog food from Wilko for £5, massive big 10-kilogram bags, adding vegetables for vitamins. I joked that he was actually looking after the dog better than himself, and he just said, "Oh, he's my best friend." We sat talking for just under an hour before he filled his empty rucksack up with the tins from the heaving carrier bags. I helped him hoist the rucksack onto his shoulders and worried that his undernourished frame wasn't quite going to take the weight of the food he had to carry home some 3 miles away on foot. At first, I struggled with deciding whether to include Paul's story in the book. On the face of it, he fitted into many of the sort of stereotypes surrounding food bank use. He spent what little money he had on drugs, alcohol, and his dog. He got sanctioned because he couldn't be asked to get out of bed. But Paul didn't exactly have an easy life. He wasn't enjoying some lavish lifestyle on benefits. He was bored, but he didn't have any realistic job prospects. And he thought his history of being in and out of prison over a period of 20 years didn't exactly help with that. He'd been brought up in care himself after being abused when he was younger, and he didn't have any family in the area. He was lonely and in a rut. And one of the reasons he actually struggled to get out of bed in the morning was his long-term mental health problems, which were worsened due to his heroin use that had been going on for 20 years. But one of the reasons I really wanted to tell Paul's story was because on the surface, it would be all too easy for him to be branded with this undeserving label that we hear from politicians so often. But food is a basic human right that shouldn't be denied to somebody just because they're taking drugs, smoking, or drinking alcohol. And I think Paul's story shows how he doesn't actually fit into the stereotype of someone who's living it up on benefits. He'd had a difficult life from a very early age, filled with abuse, drug misuse, mental health issues, and countless spells in prison. So can we really blame Paul for the choices that he is or isn't making now? So that's one of the things that I've really sort of tried to confront head on in the books. I get asked a lot about whether people using food banks are genuine or not. And I think if we think about it in that way, it's just not helpful at all, because if you see someone like Paul who, he's using a food bank 9 times, he's, long-term drug use, couldn't be asked to get out of bed, so he'd end up with a sanction. If you can imagine the Daily Mail sort of reporting on that and really having a field day with it, right? So I think it's really difficult that when we have these conversations that we have to look at it in either the sort of genuine, deserving, sort of saintly-like benefits recipient compared to somebody, say, like Paul, who doesn't fit into that, but then really does need to have, really does need support, perhaps even more support than some other people, given his sort of multiple vulnerabilities. But I think overall, as I alluded to earlier, some of the main reasons why people are using food banks are very much linked to problems with benefits, with the delays and the sort of changes that have been going on and that we're going to see a lot more of. But also I think it's important as well when I'm talking about this is to talk about people who are in work. So I think a lot of people over the years I've been doing this research very much associate food bank use with people who are on benefits. And I think we hear a lot about that, but a bit less about actually the experiences of people who are in work. For instance, I spoke to people in the book who were working on 0 hours contracts, who didn't know from sort of 1 week to the next how much money that they were going to be receiving. So they found themselves in work having to use a food bank, and it was something that they were, absolutely mortified about having to do. And I remember speaking to one couple, and they pulled up to the food bank in the car, and he said, the car's my life, I use it for work, but what are people going to think of me when I've got my car here and I'm putting food bank bags from the food bank in? They're going to think I'm a scrounger. So I think, again, like I said earlier, with the whole stigma, embarrassment and shame, we really feel that it really was something that people internalised a lot and took on board. And obviously that's linked to the huge political media narrative around food bank use and this idea of deserving and undeserving. And so I think as well, if we really think as well about the sort of health implications of this, because obviously the project that I've been working on has been looking at health inequalities in Stockton. And one of the reasons that I originally went to approach a food bank was because I noticed there was just a massive range of sort of emergency food outlets in Stockton that people could access. So there were at least 18 different places that people could receive emergency food. So I thought, well, given that I'm looking at health inequalities, the fact that people aren't able to access food, this seems a good place to start in looking at the sort of massive health inequalities in the borough. But for quite a lot of the people I spoke to, mental health problems was absolutely massive across the board. That stretched across whether people were in work, out of work, whatever the circumstances. Mental health problems was something that very much people who were using the food bank experienced. And I think as well, not just sort of mental health problems, but people who reported physical health problems. So there were people that I met in the food bank who'd been sort of made redundant on medical grounds or had to leave work because of certain illnesses or sickness. That meant they were now having to use a food bank. So I think there's that side of things as well, which again often goes unreported. When we're talking about the sort of these very sort of headline grabbing narratives of deserving and undeserving. But actually, there was a recent report as well by academics at Oxford that showed that there's a massive proportion, it's disproportionately that people who have illness or disability are actually using food banks. So that population are particularly vulnerable, I think, to having to actually come and ask for food at a food bank. And I think one of the other things I'd want to flag up from what I found during my time at the food bank is that actually sometimes people were experiencing rapid weight loss because they weren't actually able to access food that they needed. So rapid weight loss, there was a woman who I met she told me she was a size 16, but then within a few months not eating, she was skipping meals, trying to provide for her children. She was a size 8, and she said, normally I'd be quite happy that I've lost this weight, but actually I know I've lost it in a really unhealthy way. And she knew it wasn't good for her, but she was very much trying to sort of cut back for herself so then she could actually look after her family. And that was a story that I heard quite a lot across the research, not just from mothers trying to cut back, but also fathers. But there was particularly a gendered dimension as well, because a lot of the women that I spoke to in the food bank were often doing a lot of other sort of caring duties. They were perhaps caring for relatives or friends and family, as well as normally taking on the role of doing a lot of the housework and, the sort of reproductive work in the home as well. How am I for time? How am I doing? 5 minutes, okay. So I think what I'll sort of go on to talk about now, so that we've got plenty of time in the discussion, is just to talk a bit about really how I think that food banks are going in the future and how I think what I think should happen with food banks. Because I think now we've got to a situation really where food banks just seem to be sort of ever present. I mean, if you go to any sort of local supermarket, at the end you tend to have a basket at the end asking people to make a donation on the shop. So it'll be asking for a tin of food here or a bag of pasta. And I think that's something that has really crept up over the last few years. I think I write about it in the book, but when I was younger, you went to the supermarket, you had the sort of wheelie bins at the end to put in food for cats and dogs that were in the rescue centres, but now that's been replaced with wheelie bins to put in food for people who actually need food. And I think that's just happened so sort of slowly at first, but now it just seems to be everywhere. And I think it just seems to have become this sort of normal, accepted thing that we see everywhere. And I think that's a problem when we start to just see it as sort of the norm and a usual thing. I think really going forward, we should be really questioning, food banks should be shocking and outrageous. They shouldn't just be something that we take for granted and donate to. I think obviously while they're there is a huge need. People do need food banks, that much is obvious, but I feel it's difficult. I've felt it myself as a volunteer. You feel like you're kind of part of the problem at the same time. So, I think as long as food banks are there, yes, they need supporting, but then at the same time, I think if we don't really ask questions about why they're there and the structural problems that are driving food bank use in the first place, then I think, we're only sort of putting a stick and plaster on the issue, really. I think there needs to be, a lot more engagement, I think, with from politicians, but with, there's a vast amount of academic research, evidence from charities, frontline workers, people who are using food banks themselves, that's showing the clear, multiple complex reasons why people are using them. But to date, the government response has just been to respond by saying there are multiple and complex reasons why people use them, rather than actually taking any sort of, steps and approaches to actually address the fact that the issues that are driving people in the first place. So I think going forward, we really need to be having a conversation about what it's actually like to use a food bank, why people are there, and then hopefully having some clear dialogue with politicians. And I've been trying to do that a little bit, quite a lot with the book. We've had a little bit of success, I should say. We had a launch for the book in Westminster last year, and we managed to get cross-party representation there. I think there would have been a bit more, but it was 3 days after Brexit, so I think everyone was a bit tied up with that. But so far I'm really trying to get the messages in the book across to politicians, because it's a lot of the sort of false narrative and really negative views on food banks comes from politicians. So I think it's about trying to avoid that and really talk about food banks in a way that isn't stigmatizing, that isn't just looking at this false distinction between people who deserve it and people who don't, because the reality is a lot more complex than that. As you've seen, looking at Paul's case, the reasons why he was needing to use the food bank are very deep, very complex, and we can't just describe someone like Paul as being undeserving, because it's not helpful for anybody. So I think what I would say is, going forward, if you are going to donate to a food bank, that's great. But I think I would be saying, question why people are using them, think about it. And if you hear people, saying things, stereotypical things about food banks, or everyone can go to them, then, challenge them, say, well, actually, there is a voucher system in place. Really, that's what, just trying to really challenge that narrative going forward. Because I think if we don't, I think very much it looks already like food banks are here to stay. But I think if there's not some sort of, questioning, really sort of pushing against this food banks becoming the new normal, then I think we'll never get rid of them at all. Thank you. Kept the time all right.